Hello, I'm Jo Trysdale, one of the conveners of the new BERA STEAM Education Research SIG, offering a little provocation for our event on the 2nd of October in relation to the value of the arts in STEAM. I'm starting with the ideas or arguments of my piece. Firstly, around the idea of art making cultures and practices, which I'd like to argue are undervalued in education and particularly in STEAM. That whilst there may be rhetoric about the value of the arts, that they are not prioritised in education and typically are undervalued and used as means for learning. Second point I want to make is in relation to STEAM, that it's not a coherent term. I'm going to talk about that more in a moment, but one positive point is about the idea of real world being a common starting point that gives us a place as STEAM education researchers to build from. And from my own research, I want to argue for a greater consideration of sociocultural framing of such real world practices, particularly looking at the culture of the arts. The first question that we've posed ourselves is, what does STEAM mean? And drawing on our experience in the BERA Research Commission, where we looked at literatures and we consulted people, and also looking at literature since, it's clear that STEAM is a contested term. It's a portmanteau term. We're unclear, really, collectively, what it means. If we were to draw upon Wittgenstein's argument that for things to be connected, there needs to be some similarity, some familial connection, it's hard to see the similarity between those in STEM. Some might argue that science is the only discipline in STEM, being the only knowledge generating subject, and that maths itself is a language which is used by the STEM subjects, and engineering, a multidisciplinary area that uses the knowledge of science and the language of maths. Of course, that itself is contested, but that's the point. Perhaps more significant here is the notion of where the term STEM comes from, that it is a construct, a political construct that came from the American government with a view to developing the economic prosperity of the nation, and has become a driver in relation to many first world nations. And that political purpose itself has generated a whole series of discourses of discontent. And they may be directly with issues to do with environmentalism, or to do with the way in which science education is taught, or the way in which broader education is conceived. But nonetheless, there are a series of different critiques. Another aspect about STEAM, which I think is important in relation to my own focus, is about the arts itself. That they're typically seen here as servants, and that my experience as a arts educator and teacher educator, and someone who's directed a creative learning program where arts and creative pedagogies were used in order to serve school improvement foci, what is clear is this kind of illusion between what is arts based and what is creative, a sort of assumption that if something is arts based, it's automatically creative. And that illusion is not necessarily helpful. However, the promise here for us as a field of educational researchers coming together to develop is that the real world does seem to be a common starting point, and the real world realization of the kinds of practices of STEAM particularly. And we see that in engineering and in computer games, which are sites that exemplify STEAM because they draw upon the different perspectives and bring them together in particular ways. And so it's not surprising that also wicked or complex problems end up being the focus for us in terms of our research area, and that draws in a kind of sense of relevance to the wider world and a significance for learners that can be quite attractive, and often also brings together subjects usefully and brings in more embodied and active practices, all of which I would recommend. I've mentioned a little bit my research. I'm not going to talk in detail, but I thought I ought to just refer briefly to it. I've been involved over the last 7 to 10 years quite strongly in projects that are often conceived STEAM-like in character. For 5 years, I researched a project called the Imaginarium, which was initiated from the cultural sector and the engineering sector, calling in educators and researchers rather than the other way round. And it was brought together as a kind of a real sense of equality between the cultural and engineering partners, which was quite unique. It was a very positive project that involved teachers, children, artists, and engineers all working collaboratively, and it had really positive effects upon learners. It improved their science and design technology knowledge, which was one of the foci, but also particularly increased their self-efficacy, their sense, their confidence in themselves as being creative and capable learners. And that positive effect was picked up by head teachers who said, how do we have this for our broader group of teachers in ways that a simple project was not scalable or affordable? And that's where TeachMake developed, which I've been involved with for the last 3 years. So that has been a project of looking at how do we translate the positive learning from the Imaginarium into a framework for teachers to design their own curricula. Just to give you a sense of what that looked like in terms of the arts-based practice, you can see here a lot of physical theatre work. So children here exploring through their bodies what experiences might feel like, what materials look like, how movements happen, how to build strong structures. You can see them working here one-to-one with expert adults, but a lot of the time working with the children at the foreground, exploring, demonstrating, and trying things out. So it gives you a sense of what that might feel like. But the model that's come from it that underpins TeachMake, which we call an art making model for practice, particularly emphasises the value of this art making practice. So I would argue that what happens when practicing the arts is an exploratory culture, one in which artists tend to draw attention to living in and inquiring and finding out about what they're doing. And that, working with those materials in particular spaces with each other, develops this generative sense, this meaning making, bringing together the body and the mind in ways that affirms learners quite positively and generates the self-efficacy that we've noted. And it would appear, based on my analyses, drawing upon Leven Wenger's concept of community of practice, that that's because communities of practice are inherently social. You can see here from the diagram the way in which they argue that the communities build their learning through the relationships with each other, by talking to each other, by telling stories, sharing methods, sharing tools, watching. And that emphasizes this kind of what they call the different ways in which you can participate, that you may well potentially be at the center of work and involved with asking questions, maybe even be an expert at certain moments demonstrating yourself, or at other moments you may be watching and just literally seeing what's going on, that all these different modes of learning are legitimate and exactly what we do in real life. And it generates this sense of a community that values each other, supports each other, and grows together in very kind of horizontal and democratic ways. And also thereby learns positive learning behaviours, and that becomes something that's natural to that. And I would argue that the medium of art making, this exploratory and this community of practice, is significant for us educationally. In the model here, the real world is brought in because the commission that this community of practice undertake, which itself is modelled upon the real world and exists in real world iterations, is itself a real world commission. It's connected with something that can happen and does happen in the real world. And it draws, therefore, experts from that world, whether they are experts in terms of knowledge or whether they're experts in terms of making. And it situates knowledge inside this making practice. So this sociocultural art making community needs particular kinds of knowledge and skills in order to achieve the commission. And what the teachers are doing is designing in the particular kinds of skills and knowledge, and we're working with them to develop that. So, quick takeaways. First of all, that social cultural perspectives have enabled some growth in the value of the arts, particularly in relation to the culture of what I might call socially committed art making practices. So that isn't necessarily all. Secondly, that STEAM is not a coherent term, but our real world realization is a common point, and it's something that we should build upon as educational researchers. And finally, that the real world art making practice as should be a starting point, not just for what we do, but also for our curriculum design, because it allows us to recognize the educative qualities of the arts. And it also allows us to negotiate the prescribed curriculum with our inherent desire to develop more engaging and broader outcomes, which is at the heart of a lot of our concerns in STEAM. And that leads to a more positive effect of the arts, perhaps also identifying how the sciences might serve the arts. Thank you for listening.